Okay, so welcome then to our webinar for getting to grips with Calculate. My name is Brian Rutherford and I am the CTO data engineer, or one of the data engineers and educator here at IO Analytics. We are a data services company, Microsoft partner based in Glasgow, but we do work all over the UK. So that's a bit about me. What I'm planning on doing then in this webinar is taking you through everything you need to know about how to get to grips with Calculate. Before I talk about the agenda itself, I should probably do a wee bit of a kind of preamble. So sometimes with these webinars, you'll have a kind of tag team of 2 or 3 people, kind of they sort of slap each other's hands, and then another person comes along and they do a bit more about some other kind of subject. You are unfortunately going to have to listen to me talking for most of this time, but I think that should be okay. Hopefully I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. I won't try to drone. I'll try to make my kind of my voice modulation as interesting as possible, going up and down, etc. Trying to keep things as least kind of or less boring as possible. But hopefully you will find the subject quite interesting. That's the kind of first thing. Secondly, as you see here, we're going to go through a number of I guess phases in this getting to grips with the Calculate webinar. And we'll see then this is an educational webinar, which is going to be a case of taking you through how to understand Calculate from the basics all the way through to some kind of interesting kind of ideas you might not come across before. With that in mind then, it's going to be quite a bit like a sort of philosophical argument, in the sense that we start simple, then we build up and we build up and we build up. And we can't really escape doing that. So I'll explain as we do that why I'm covering those particular subjects. But we are going to be kind of going through this particular function from the basics up to some interesting ideas. And hopefully at the end of this educational webinar, then you'll be armed with the knowledge that you need to get to grips with the Calculate and begin to get some power out of it. With that in mind, then I'm going to cover the following subjects. We're going to cover some basics around Power BI. I guess if you're coming on a DAX webinar, I'm kind of guessing you probably use webinar. You might even be quite good at using DAX as well. You might be an expert at using DAX, in fact. But we can't really start without doing a few kind of preamble kind of basics about, well, what is Power BI? What are the component parts of it? And where does this particular part of it come in then, the actual DAX calculation in terms of our kind of workflow? So we'll do that, and then if you've never seen Power BI before, you should have enough of a kind of bluffer's guide to kind of to then get into to do this, so understanding what Calculate actually is. We'll then look at Calculate as a kind of first pass over. So we'll take a look at what it actually is, talk about what it's supposed to do, and then we'll say, right, fine, if that's the purpose of Calculate and how we're going to get to grips with it, we'll have to understand then a couple of other building blocks that make up how Calculate actually behaves. And they're going to be what's called the row context, which is what you get when you create a calculated column. Filter context is what you get when you create a measure. And so you're probably thinking, well, what are these things if you've never seen them before? I'll explain what they actually are. And you can find 100 YouTube videos right now on what filter and row context actually are, but hopefully I can cut to the nub of what they actually mean, particularly around Calculate, because Calculate is using these contexts to work out the calculation. So that's why it's super important for us to actually cover these 2 really important ideas. And once you get the ideas, then hopefully the penny will drop and you'll go, right, okay, I get it. I see actually how this actually is being used and how I can use it as well. Then we'll swing back on Calculate, and I'll take you through some examples of that. We'll use a pointer here. So I'm going to, at that point, start off by doing some very basic examples, and then we'll build it up. And we'll see then that it's a very powerful function that you can use within your DAX calculations within Power BI, one that you're probably going to use quite a lot, in fact. We'll cover all that as part of that chapter, that phase. The last part there, part 6, I've kind of talked about, or I'm going to talk about Calculate and an idea called context transition. So if you've ever come across context transition in books about Power BI, or again, YouTube videos and kind of guides, etc., you might kind of be scratching your head a wee bit thinking, what actually is this? Well, I'm going to show you, hopefully, a super simple example, which will again give you that kind of light bulb moment, and you go, all right, okay, so yeah, you can do really complicated things with this, but the fact that at its basic, it's doing a particular thing called context transition. and I'll explain what that actually is. It's all to do with row and filter context. There's a clue for you there. So they're being transited in some kind of way. Okay. So if that's the case, then let's talk a wee bit about, I guess, some basics. And with that in mind, then my first thing to say about that is that we're going to be, we're going to be looking at a database called AdventureWorks. I know it's not that complicated a database, but it's a great one for learning. It's a great one for teaching things. So this is one we're going to be using. And if you come across it before, then great. But you'll find it's just all about the sales of bikes and accessories of kind of various kinds. But it's got products, it's got returns, sales and returns. It's got all the elements that you might expect to see in some kind of simple teaching type database. And we'll come back to that. We'll show you that very shortly. Okay. Here we go. So, as part of the basics, quick preamble. Again, forgive me, those who know this already, just bear with me for a second or two. Just for people who don't know this, then Power BI then is this application, and there's a particular flow to how you then begin to deal with your data within Power BI. So we're going to start with the first part of that flow, is that you would go in then and you might connect to your data. So you've got the connection option there. You then might take that data you connected to and you want to transform it. So there's a tool within Power BI called Power Query. Pretty strange idea to have an app within an app, but there it is. So you've got this application within Power BI that kind of fires up, and within that application what you can do is you can take those data sets that you've imported of kind of various kinds of tables, let's say, and you can then begin to transform them in kind of various ways. So that's fine, we can accept that. So that's kind of the first part of our kind of workflow. Second part of the workflow is once you've transformed your data, you then might go in and you might build your model. So that is, you're going to take those data sets and you might then set up the relationships between those particular tables, as it might be. So you can see here that in my AdventureWorks database, I brought in these tables. So I've got a whole bunch of lookup tables to do with things like my calendar information, so that's things like dates and years. I've got my customers. I've got the territories in which I do my particular sales, the products that I sell, the categories of my products, and then beneath those lookup tables, I might have my fact tables, I guess you could use that phrase for them. So that's the kind of transactional data itself. So that's my sales transactions and my returns transactions. So while we're here, we're just going to take a look at this and go, okay, that's interesting because I've got, first of all, these joins here telling me how one of these tables relate to the next. So park that in your mind for a second or two, because that's part of this idea of context we're going to come back to. I've got, as well as that, these arrows that appear on my joins indicating the direction of some kind of flow. Okay, that's interesting. So we're going to park that again, put that on the sticky board and come back to that later on as well. So that's the second part of our workflow. We've got our data, we've transformed it, we then model it in this model here. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Typically what you then do is you'll go in then and you'll go to your table view and you'll go to the tables here and you'll begin to kind of to work with these. So you might go to your calendar table, your customer lookup, begin to then manipulate these. So what do you do at that point? What you might then do at that point is you might go and create some columns, some extra columns to then enhance those tables. You might have done that before in the transformation part of it, but we're going to do it, let's say here, we're going to add some extra columns into my tables to enhance them, which means that I'm going to add a calculated column. So again, stick that on the sticky board for a minute or two. Once you've done that, you've maybe kind of done that enhancement of your kind of data, you might think, well, I'm then going to visualize it and I'm going to go to my report view. And at this point here, you might then go in to insert things like tables, charts of kind of various kinds. And since you've done all of that data preparation and modeling and adding in the extra columns to your data, then you can go in and you can visualize it at the end of this process. And when you're doing that, at that point, you might also then begin to go and create what are called measures, which are calculations that are going to appear in your visualizations. Okay. So at this point here, we're going to say that we've got two kinds of calculations we're going to be creating in DAX that we're going to be using calculate for. And the first of these is going to be for columns. So we're going to create a calculated column. And when I do that, I'll create some kind of column in a table that I'm going to be using for filtering. So that's typically what you might do when you create these columns. They're really for filtering, and you might add one. You can make that out very briefly. I've got one there called parent, saying whether the person's actually a parent, yes or no. These columns that I add in behave in a particular way. They return values based upon what's called the row context. So let's come back to that in a short while. The second kind of calculation that you'll create will be one that's not in a table, but one that's going to be used in a visualization. And that calculation is called a measure. So they're going to be typically for things like aggregating data. And what they'll do with them is that they're going to go in and they'll be in your visualizations and they'll behave based upon the context of the filters that surround it. And again, we'll come back to that very shortly. And that's what they call filter context. So we've kind of got these two things here called row context and filter context. And these are fundamental to understanding Calculate and the way that Calculate actually behaves. So I'm going to explain what these actually are. But before I do that, though, we're just pointing out the fact that there are two kinds of calculations. And the way they behave really depends upon where you create them. So you might create them as a column, and they've got one kind of behavior. You might create them as a measure, and they have a second kind of behavior. And that's really kind of getting to the crux of the way we're going to see this very shortly in our use of Calculate. I should also say as well, as part of this preamble, that typically, again, with these kind of demonstration type kind of things, you might have someone typing out code, type. You have to watch the person typing it out. I will do a bit of that, but I'm going to probably use mostly sort of pre-built calculations, just so you don't have to watch me typing things out. And secondly, I guess because it would still be here at 5:30, you had to watch me kind of typing out lots of different kind of calculations. So that's my kind of excuse for not having to go and actually type things out all the time. I think it's a good way to approach it. We'll do a kind of mix and match of that. Okay, so buffers guide done, database, we're going to use that, Eventual Works. We get a sense then that we're going to be doing, we're going to be creating columns and measures. So with that in mind then, let's go one step further and let's talk a wee bit about Calculate itself then. So Calculate, if we look at the syntax example just here, is a function that's going to be a calculation of some kind working upon my data. Okay, we can accept that. And the Calculate itself takes two kinds of parameters. It takes, first of all, an expression, which can either be a measure or a formula itself. So that is going to be either a measure, that's a pre-built calculation that I've already built, called, let's say, total orders. I can then take that total orders and then work upon it. So we're going to be doing that again and again during our webinar. Or it might be an actual DAX formula itself that says, right, fine, I want to go and get the sum of the return quantity from my returns data table. So that's perfectly valid as well. So you have the expression, and then the expression is followed by filters. So the filter is going to go in then, and it's going to be affecting the calculation. So it could be, for example, give me the total orders where the territory lookup country is equal to the USA. So think of it then as being like a where clause. And that's effectively what it is. You're adding a kind of a where clause to your calculation. So you have your total orders. You can add that to a table, and that's fine. There's all the orders that you want to see, let's say, category by category. But then you want to maybe go and say, yeah, but I want to see the total orders for the USA. So whenever you have a need, and you will definitely have this, to take a calculation and make it actually show you a particular set of values, then that's where Calculate comes into its own, and you're absolutely going to be using this in your Power BI reports, because it's one of these things which you're going to have to use again and again. And we'll see you can put filters in elsewhere, sure, but this is a way to go and create a calculation that returns a particular value based upon a filter, or filters plural. So you can add as many as you want to. And again, we'll see some of these very shortly. So again, as a preamble here, just to kind of set the scene for Calculate, all I'm going to say is that it lets you, and it says here at the bottom, it lets you override the existing report filters to force a new filter context. I should really clarify that. What it does is it lets you add to the filter context, or it lets you override, depending upon what you're trying to do. And we'll see some examples of that very shortly. So if you're not clashing with anything that's in the existing set of filters, it will just add to it. Great. If it clashes with something and there's some kind of clash between the filters, let's say you've got your country data saying, show me it for, let's say, the UK, and you said, yeah, but show me this for USA, the USA part of it overrides it. So it's going to be overriding those filters. So again, that's just a kind of quick overview of that. And I'm going to come back to this this sentence later on in our kind of a run through, and it'll make a bit more sense when we've gone through the other elements of this. Okay, so that's our kind of overview or sort of first pass over what Calculate actually does. Let's go in then and we're going to move on, and we're going to do that by doing the following. We can't really understand how Calculate works unless we understand all the building blocks that make it so powerful. That is the context of the many elements that affect the calculation. So that word context you're going to come across again and again in Power BI. Think of context as being the surroundings that then affect its behavior. And that's what context actually is, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's what surrounds something. So I used to think to myself then when I came across this phrase initially when I was looking at Power BI many years ago, I kind of thought, that's a terrible word to use. Context, what does it mean? What does it mean? But in fact, it actually makes perfect sense when I tell you it's what surrounds the calculation that sits in the middle. It's how it's going to behave. And when you understand that, then okay, that word context is actually really quite a good one to use. So let's take a look then at the row context. And for that, we're going to kind of lay it out, first of all, by saying that the row context appears naturally when you create a calculated column. So we didn't get that before in the previous slide I showed you a minute ago. When you create a column in the table view and you're adding a new column to generate some kind of value, that's going to use a thing called row context. And it means that the calculation is going to evaluate itself row by row. For example, dead simple example, let's imagine we're going to go in, we're going to add to our customer lookup table, and I want to say the following. Okay, create a new measure, so I create a new column, I should say, and that column will have consist of the following calculation. It's going to say if the customer lookup total children is greater than 0, then yes, that person is a parent, else no, they're not. Okay, so a really simple example. So let's go and look at that right now. So we're going to go back to our webinar example here. I'm going to go back to my table, go to my customer lookup. Here is the column that contains my total children. I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a new column. So I'm going to go to my menu bar at the top here to create a new column. And then we'll take this one out. So let's just call this one parent. Okay, so we're going to say, right, parent, we're going to say if the customer lookup number of children is greater than 0, then action if true is yes. Else, action if false is no. Okay, so nice simple calculated column there. If I then just accept that, off it goes, and it says, and then tags these values in here, adds the values in here on the right-hand side as the last column in my table. I do actually have some people who do have more than one, or who actually have children, and you'll see they do actually exist. So if I go to my filter here, I can then go and see, yeah, that's fine. Let's see those people. Okay, fair enough, that's great. Let's go back to that again. Select all. Okay, cool. When you create a column like this using DAX, it creates a new column in your table, it generates the values and it adds those values to the model. So that's not going to go in and say, I'm only going to create them on the fly whenever you need them. It actually adds them into the model. So you're adding more data to the model itself. Okay, well, you can see here, it's going then to this person here called Shannon Carson, and it's saying, right, fine, what's that person's got in terms of total children? That's fine. Next row, next row, next row, next row, next row, all the way down, row by row by row by row by row. So that's what's meant by row context. The context of the calculation is how it's going to behave, and it's going to behave on a row by row basis, because that's the element that's it's being fed into a table with multiple rows. Okay, it's as simple as that. So I think we all get, you know, if you looked at that yourself and you probably think, okay, I kind of get that. I can see how that actually works. So if I'm adding in columns then to my tables, then it's going to work on a row by row basis. I expect that to be the case. I guess I should clarify one other kind of aspect as well. When I do that though, this table here, the calculations that I add in here are not aware of other columns in the model. They're only aware of the columns that are in this table. They can't see in inverted commas those other tables. So again, put that on sticky board, park that for a second or two, we'll come back to that. Okay, if that's the row context, then the next one we're going to look at is the filter context, because calculate is all about these contexts, these behaviors, whether it's the row or the filter context. And the filter context in particular is the one that's super important for Calculate. Row does come into it, that's why I showed you that, but filter is the one that we're really going to kind of concentrate on here. So what this means then is the filter context appears naturally in measures. And we use our measures when we go and we build our visualization. So we might create a measure for total orders or quantity ordered or something like that. And we're going to add it into our Power BI system, into the application itself, but it doesn't appear anywhere until we combine it in a chart. So unlike the column, which is actually a column in a table, and when you go to that table, it's there, it's always there in that table from that point forward when you create it. When you create a measure, you create a calculation, as we'll see very shortly, that in fact only really appears and only is actually calculated when you actually use it in a visualization like a chart or a table. If that's the case, then what happens is that when you are adding that to your chart or your table, there are elements that feed in to the calculation. And this is the context that surrounds that calculation. So it's basically, what are the values you're combining it with in the visual? How does it sit in the model in terms of the relationships? So am I able to use those relationships to then go in and figure out what that value actually is? Are there any filters on the page? Are there any filters applied to the report? Are there any filters in the slicers that might be on that page as well? So all those things together are actually affecting the calculation. And as the fifth step, then it's also affected by any filters that have been added in by some kind of DAX calculation. And that, in fact, is what Calculate does. So Calculate takes these and it can add to them or it can override them. So that's the kind of key to it. So when I talk about, or anybody talks about the filter context, you might be thinking, what is that strange thing? It's just literally just this. It's just what surrounds that calculation as it sits in that visualization, in that table, or in that chart. That's just the way it is. We've got columns, but we've also got charts. And when we have our calculations in our charts, they're going to be measures. They're always going to be measures, in which case then it's a bit of a kind of change of mindset because we've got a bit more happening with a measure. We've got more things feeding into it than not just saying, right, give me the total quantity. Yeah, it says, right, fine, but what about this filter over here, or this relationship over here, or this page filter over here, or this slicer? All of those are feeding in to that calculation. But you can override or you can add to it using the calculate function. So here we go. Let's go do some basic ones to begin with. So we're going to do two new measures. We're going to call, I'm going to show you this anyway, called order quantity and total orders. So we'll just talk about the context, the filter context first of all. And I'm going to have the sum of my order quantity. So pretty straightforward function there. It's when we're going to go and do a distinct count of the order numbers in my table, because I might have in my sales table that order number, let's say 001, appearing multiple times because that in fact was an order for multiple different products. So to get the number, to count it as one order, I'm going to do a distinct count. Okay. If we go back here to our Power BI, we're going to go and do exactly that. Wait, so I'm going to add in my, just do it here in fact. So you may or may not have seen before, one of the new features of Power BI is this thing called the build menu, which is pretty handy, which actually is a preview feature that you can switch on in the options in the background. And it just means that you can actually look at your visualization and you can mess about with the data in it in the same place rather than having to go to the right-hand side and then figure out what the hell's going on over here to then go and pick things. So it's pretty handy. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add from my product category lookup, I'm going to go for category name. Okay, that's simple. I'm going to go to add data. I'm going to add in my order quantity. So I've got a pre-built version. Okay. I think I might also add in my total orders as well while we're here. Okay. So the filter context I've already explained to you is a combination of different elements. And what happens then is that when Power BI looks at this visualization, it looks at the field that you've brought in, it says, okay, this is the category name. What's the first value in that field? It's accessories. So it says, right, fine, accessories. I need to figure out, first of all, you've asked me to go and return the order quantity and the total orders from the sales table. So is there a relationship between the two? Yes, there is. I've got my product category over here, and I can then use these relationships, these joins, to go and join to the sale table and figure out the total orders and the total number of order numbers. So that's the kind of first element that feeds into the so-called filter context. Secondly, it's looking and it says, right, fine, is there any kind of filter being applied elsewhere? So yeah, there might be, like, for example, a slicer down here. I might want to go and maybe just pick a particular value. If I choose that, that's going to affect, again, what's being displayed here in the actual calculation itself. And then thirdly, I might want to go in and I might want to have a filter over here. This I'm actually going to put in one for year. Again, this is just the basic preamble here, so forgive me for just doing this, but it's all good stuff. So do some basic filtering. And I'm saying, yeah, give me these figures here, but for the year 2022. Okay. Oops. Try that again. Okay, that's grand. Okay, so I'm going to go in here 2 seconds. Try that again. Try that again. Here. Basic filtering. What's a little bit of a mistake? Okay, so you see it changing based upon the figures that I choose just here. That's fine. So all of that's feeding into the filter context. That's the context of what surrounds my calculation, and then as it says, is affecting what's being appeared, what actually is worked out as that calculation. Okay, so now we understand that. I'm just going to delete that for a second. That's what's called the filter context. So, okay, we're going to park that for a second. If that's the case, then what does calculate do? So here we go, we'll get to the number of it now. So calculate then is a calculation that's able to go in then and modify those filters. So we know it's able to go in actually and overrule the existing filters that have been applied. And it can also, so it can force a new filter context, but it can also go in and it can actually add to it as well. It can be additive as well as overriding it. So that's why that makes a bit more sense now. We say it evaluates an expression down here in a context that is modified by filters. Okay, we get to the main event. So now we understand then row context, filter context, filters that surround my calculation. And now I know that I've got this function called calculate that's actually able to go in and actually mess about and play about with that context. The next bit makes a bit more sense. So here's some examples then of what we can do. We can go in, we can create a Boolean type uses of calculate. We will have a Boolean filter. Remember, we've got this these filters just here. So what kind of filters can you actually add in? We're going to look at 2 types. We can look at Boolean type kind of filters, and we're going to look at what's called filter modifiers to then see that we can actually modify our data. So let's talk about this first one here. So I've been asked to go in and I've been asked to go and get back the total order quantity, but where the order quantity being ordered is greater than 1. So I'm going to call this one bulk orders. There's my calculate function. I'm saying calculate. And notice here what I'm doing is I'm actually going to call upon an existing measure. So this is typically what you might do. You might go and create your basic measures. So total this, average that kind of idea. And what you then do is you'll then go to your next step, which is say, right, fine, I'm going to take that measure, I'm going to plug that into a calculate and get a filtered version of it. And that's what's happening here. I'm going to say, right, fine, give my existing order quantity measure, but give me where the sales data quantity is greater than 1. That's my bulk orders. Or I might say, right, I want to go in here and I've got a measure called total orders, but I happen to have in my calendar lookup table, I've got a way of tagging the days, whether they might be a weekday or the weekend. And in my calculation here, using calculate, I've said, right, calculate on the total orders where the calendar lookup is equal to weekend. So again, it's this kind of idea of a kind of where clause that we're using here to then go and actually amend the way that this calculation behaves. I've got a third example just there, which is going to be an interesting one to look at. You'll see that very shortly. This one's going to be a particular one, which is going to say, right, fine, give me all the bike sales. So this one here says, take the order quantity, and I want to go in and I want to get where it's the orders where the category is equal to bikes and bikes only. Now, I mentioned before this idea of it's able to override the context of the filters. Yeah, this collection of filters that surrounds my calculation. So the filter that surrounds my calculation or the quantity might be saying, right, fine, give me all of these categories and give me the order quantity for that. But I'm going to override that to say, yeah, give it just for bikes. And we'll see this in a second or two. We're going to try this out. So here we go. Let's just try this out. I want to add to my table just here. So I'm going to go to the right-hand side here to my measures. So I've got these pre-built already just to kind of save any kind of having to type things out. So I'm going to go to my bulk orders. I want to add that to my table. Okay, so that's fine. So it says, right, fine, of the total order quantity that was there, these are the ones where the orders at the time were greater than 1. And you can see here that in my case, I've got no orders for bikes that are like that. I've got a lot of accessories being sold, which kind of makes sense. So you want to go and you buy your more than one accessory for your bike, like pedals and chains, etc. You're going to probably going to buy multiple items at that particular point. You're probably only going to buy one bike. So that's why the bike one is actually blank here. So that's fine. So there we go. So that's an interesting way to see that. And I hope you get a sense of then how, because this could be useful because we get to see not just the totals of our ordered our quantities and the actual orders, but we get to see customized versions of these saying, right, give me the bulk orders. How about our weekend orders? How about that? I want to go and see the ones that were actually ordered at the weekend. So we're going to go and add that in. Let's do it here. Okay, so again, of my total orders that were made there, these are the amounts that were actually done at the weekend. That's quite a lot. Maybe it's to do with the fact that I've got more customers coming in at the weekend to the store, something like that. So you get to see then, you get to see these customized calculations that you cannot get any other way apart from using Calculate to go in and actually get this customization, this kind of filtering of the data itself. So the next part of this we're going to talk about is our bike sales. And this one is one that's probably going to be a bit strange to kind of first look at, but it does kind of make sense now. I've kind of hopefully set this up for you. So if I go to here and add in my bike sales. Okay, so here are the total orders for my bikes. And in fact, that's the figure that I'm getting here in this column all the way down. And it's doing that because what's happening is it's overriding the filter context. In this case, it says, I don't care what you have elsewhere. I'm always going to just give you the figure for bikes because that's what you've asked for. So in our calculation there, we said, okay, just give me the quantity where the category is equal to bikes. Will it always work that way? Well, yes, it will. If I was to go to my slicer diff down here and said, right, I want to go and see just clothing, it goes, that's fine, that's the clothing, but in fact, here's still the bike sales. So it just overrides whatever that filter happens to be. The filter that's added in there is saying, yeah, show me just the clothing, but this one says, aye, that's fine, but I'll also just show you the bike sales because that is going to always display that particular value for you. Okay, so that's examples of using some kind of Boolean type filters in Calculate to then go in and restrict what we get back. Let's talk about some other variations of that. Two variations I'm going to introduce you to. I think we're okay for time. And these are super important, the ones you're probably going to use quite a lot as well. And these are called modifiers. The first of these is the all modifier. So we're going to look at all, we're going to look at filter as well. So the all modifier says, okay, I'm going to use a function called all that will feed in either a table or a column. And I'm going to give you all of the values from that table or from that column, regardless of what's been set elsewhere. I'm going to completely ignore the context of the filters. So things like whether I've got a year filter on the page or whatever I'm showing in the table, doesn't matter. It's going to ignore all of that and say, I'm always going to give you all of the values that you've asked for. So basically, it just clears all the filters away, just gives me all the kind of values. So that's quite useful because it basically removes all the filters and just returns that each time. So how could I use that then? Well, it's typically used in, as it says here, something like this, one of these kind of sort of percentage of a total. Some kind of ratio type kind of calculation is where you would typically use all, and it's particularly powerful in calculate. So let me show you an example of that. I've been asked to go and get the percentage split across my categories of my orders, yeah, to see which orders are the highest or lowest percentage, etc. To do that, I'm going to use my calculate. I'm going to say, right, let's call this one all orders. Calculate, open brackets. It's got at least two parameters, or in fact, at least one. In fact, actually, I'm saying, give me all of the values returned by total orders. That's fine. So work out that particular value there. Sorry, give me the total orders. Give me the sum of the orders, I should say. But where it's for all of the sales data. So all of the orders and sales data, regardless of what's been set elsewhere, always feed in the total orders for all of the sales data. Okay, I'll let that sink in for a second. Okay, if that's the case then, what I can then do afterwards is I can say, right, fine, well, if I got that, what I can then do is I can then create another measure, call it percentage of all orders, for example. And I can say, right, fine, could you go in then and could you divide? This is a function within that DAX called divide. It takes two parameters. It takes the total orders and it's going to divide it by all orders. So that's what's going to happen. There's a third parameter that returns a value if it's divided by 0, but not going to bother with that. So this is going to give me then basically this percentage, this ratio in the output. Okay, well, let's try this out then. So let's go back to our Power BI. I'll go to the table here, just add it to my table as we go on. So to show you, first of all, I'm going to go in, I'm going to go to my add data. From my measures, I'm going to choose to add in the one called all orders. So it says, right, fine, regardless of what's been set elsewhere, I'm always going to give you back the total number of orders. And do we know that? Yes, we know it. It says 25164 here. Therefore, that's the figure I'm getting back again and again and again. So it's looking at accessories and it says, oh, do you want to get the accessories orders? No, in fact, I'm going to override that and just give you all of the orders each time. Okay, again, you can see this. I'll do another quick example. If I just do that, bring filter and clothing. Yeah, that's what I'm getting for these. But in fact, because these have been affected by my filter context, but this one here is unaffected by the filter context. It just says, right, fine, I'm going to give you the total regardless. If I can have that, we know then we can exploit that. We can create this typical thing called a kind of ratio type, percentage type kind of view. So back to my table here once again. Let's add it in once more. I'm going to call this 1% of all orders. Okay, there we have it. So that's really useful. I can now get to see then this percentage split across all of my different categories, in this case, to see who's got the highest percentage in terms of sales or orders and who's got the lowest. That's pretty useful. You can't get that any other way. You have to use this idea of calculate to set this up, to say, right, fine, I want to go and give me a figure that's going to give me the total regardless, and I can then use that in another measure. And I guess that's the kind of big idea that I'm kind of, I guess, coming back to as well here, is not only am I going in and creating a measure and calling upon existing measures, I'm creating another measure that's going to go and, yeah, in this case, pull this one in as well. Okay, so that's the all modifier. If that's the all modifier, you probably think to yourself then, okay, is there some way I can get a subset of data? Rather than giving me all, give me some kind of subset that I can then use in a similar way. And the answer is yes. And that's called filter. So this modifier then you can use in your calculate to then go in and do exactly that. It says here, it returns a table that represents a subset of another table or expression. So the way it works is you can go in and you can put in your filter function, saying, right, call upon this table, and then go and filter it in the following way. So for example, pull in customer lookup and only give me the, or maybe pull in territory lookup and then only give me the records where the territory is equal to USA. So I got this kind of table in memory now, kind of cursor type kind of thing in memory that I can then use And I can use that in the same way that I did my all example to say, give me all of the values. I'm saying then give me a subset of these values instead. Okay. So how does it look then? Well, we're going to use this in a kind of three-stage example here. And again, I'll just talk you through this. Hope this makes some sense. Okay, I'm doing time-wise, right? Almost Q2, good. So we've got here, number one, average retail price. So I've been asked to go and create a measure that does that. So that's fine. I'm saying then, fine, look at the product lookup table where I have my prices and give me the average product price. And you might want to present that beside, let's say, your categories. So again, I might just do it right now, in fact, just to kind of build it up bit by bit. So here we go. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go to my objects, my calculations, and add in my average retail price. Okay. Good. So for the different categories, it's working it out. What's the average retail price for my accessories, bikes, etc. Okay, that's fine. It seems like a pretty sensible start. Next one. Then I go in and say, well, do you know what? I want to be able to go in and maybe have this where it's actually got the overall average price. So that's this idea. It'd be really great if I could actually have that figure there, that's 71444, that overall average price, and have that held in a calculation. Okay, so for that, I'm going to use my all once again. So we can see, I'm going to say, right, fine, calculate, open bracket, at least two parameters here. I've got give me the average retail price that I've just created, but could you give me it based upon all of the products in the product lookup table? So that's the kind of where it's all the products I'm looking at. So where it's all the products is maybe a kind of way to phrase it. Okay, so we'll do that, and I guess we'll build it into a table as well. Here we go, let's add it in. So here we go. Once again. Here we go. Okay, so that's my overall average price. And since I've used it all, we've already seen how this actually works. It's basically going to say, right, fine, I'm going to override the filter context that surrounds the calculation, and I'm going to just replace it with this one saying I want to look then at all of these products. Okay, here's the payoff. So at the end of that process, then you think, well, where do we go with this, Brian? The answer is this. I want to go and create, finally, an ability to create what's called high ticket orders. So I'm interested in people who've maybe bought items that are higher than the overall average price of 714. So how do I do that? Well, I can use calculate. So when I'm thinking about creating some kind of calculation that involves some kind of restriction or where clause, it's calculate I'm going to be using for that. So when you say then, right, fine, high ticket orders, where the total orders, so give me the total orders, I should say where they are part of the records being returned by this filter. So when they're in the results of the records being returned by this filter, and this filter says, okay, generate a table based upon product lookup, generate a table of records, and that table of records will have the following restriction applied to it. It's only the records with the product price is greater than the overall average price. Okay, so that's a big setup then to then go and get this kind of interesting kind of result. So let's see that. If we go back here to my table, adding that in. Okay, so that's given us the result. That's not too exciting in this example because we've got, it happens to be that in fact most of our bikes happen to be more than 714.44, which is why that tends to be the figure that's actually in there in that result. My point being though, is that you're using this other modifier, this powerful modifier to go in and create a subset of the data that you're using in this filtering process within Calculate. Okay, so we've seen then how we can go in and we have these Boolean type restrictions. We've seen the use of all, and we've seen the use of filter. Let's go one step further. And I want to talk about as the last thing today, that's just time-wise, but is a quite an important idea. It's called context transition. So this is the one which, again, you can look it up. You're probably scratching your head thinking, what the hell is this all about? Because it's a bit of a strange idea. And I'm hopefully going to show you a super simple example of what it is. So here we go. I've been asked to go and create a calculated column. And that column is going to give me I'm going to add it to my customer table, and it's going to give me the sum of the order quantities that have been ordered by those customers on a customer by customer basis. Okay, that seems like a sensible thing to do. So I'm going to go back to my tables here on the left hand side. I'm going to go to my customer lookup table. And in true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I have set up previous to this. So this is called total quantity row context. Okay, so I said then, okay, in the customer table, so park that for a second, remember that, I'm adding in a column that says, could you go please to the model and could you figure out the sum of order quantity and could you add that to my table? And because we're doing this on a row by row basis, could you then figure out what's going to be for this row, this row, this row, this row, this row, this row, and so on and so on and so on, all the way down. Well, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because tables by default can't see, in inverted commas, the other joins in the model. It doesn't go, it looks like it goes, right, I'm only interested in the columns that are in this table. So prior to this, then we created this measure called, or this column called parent. That was perfectly fine because that would quite happily go number of children, number of children, number of children. But this one here, we're asking it to go out to the model, take a look at the joins and figure out, okay, here's my product table and here's my customer table and here's my sales table. I want to go and work out the actual sum of quantity for this particular person called Mr. Shannon Carson. It can't do it. Therefore, what I get back is I get the total of the quantity for that sales table, which is why we get the 84174 all the way down. But here's the clever part. This is the bit at the end of this process. Calculate, in fact, has got quite a smart, clever behavior. What happens is if you create a column in your table and you create it using calculate, it goes, all right, I see what you're trying to do. And it does a thing called context transition. It flips over to filter context. Now we know that filter context is this context of all the elements that surround the calculation, such as the joins in the tables, yeah, and the filters that exist, maybe in the DAX calculation, etc. It just flips over to filter context and says, right, okay, see what you're trying to do here. I'm clever enough to actually understand what you're trying to do. Essentially doing it in the calculate function. I've been told, and I know that the calculate function has this flip behavior called context transition. So if I do the same thing, but I place it into a calculate function, it works. Let's try it out. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to go back here. I've got this example here. I said, right, fine. Give me the same thing. Give me the sum of the order quantity in the sales data table. And since I've done it in a calculate, it says, okay, I'll do this context transition. I'll flip from row to row. And I'll go flip, bump, bump. I'll do it as a filter version instead, i.e. I'll behave like a filter context, but I'll do it where I can work out on a row by row basis what each of these people actually have in terms of the number of elements they've actually bought from AdventureWorks. So it can then give you all of the individual figures that you need. And that's what they call context transition. Okay, so it's a bit like a mind-bending idea, but it is quite a powerful one. And that's really the kind of the element which completes the picture around calculate to let us see then how it actually behaves. Okay, so just going back here for just 2 seconds. Yeah, here we go. I'll do this here. My apologies. So this is where it says, right, find, that's the row context behavior. It does this transition and it flips it over and it says, right, fine, I'm now aware of the relationships in the model. And you could even add in filters. So if I go back for a second here, I could actually go in to this. I could add in comma and years equal to 2020. And I could get back all of the ones that were for that particular year in that customer table. So for example, here, I could go to here and add in another clause to say, right, fine, I've been trying to see what actually working on calendar. Oh, it's not that one actually. Yeah, I can add another filter basically to say, give me the year equal to 2020, and those figures would actually change based upon that. Okay, let's go back for a second here. summary at the end there. Okay, so that's been almost an hour. I think you've given a kind of whistle-stop tour there. I wanted to finish off with a few kind of final things, but hopefully that makes some sense so far in terms of calculate. So we looked at the big picture of Power BI. We understand it's a function that's to do with the contexts. We now have a better understanding of what row context is and filter context. We've now got swinging back and calculate. Okay, well, let's go and look, in fact, actually, how we can use calculate. Then finally, we've got that last part there, which is to say, right, well, this strange idea of context transition isn't that strange. Once you understand these two types of context behaviors, we can actually do this thing when it flips over. Okay, 1 second here. Before we finish off, a couple of things to say. First of all, thanks so much for taking part. That was I thought that was quite interesting actually. Preparing for that myself actually I was like I think how to explain this in a way that I can do it in an hour, because normally these kind of things take a lot longer. The DAX part of the course that we do is probably about kind of half day, so I've managed to squeeze quite a lot of that into an hour just there. So I hope you found that useful. If you want to, please put questions into the Q&A there. I'm probably going to finish off. It's probably obviously a Thursday. It's almost 5 o'clock, but I can take those questions and I'll mail you with any answers to any questions you might have brought up there. So please do add your questions into the Q&A if you have there, or you can always drop me a line as well. I'll give you my email address in a second or two. This is part of Spy Surprise, a set of courses that we deliver here at Analytics with Microsoft partners, and we've got a 2-day Power BI course with a really powerful, useful reference manual using those slides I just seen a minute ago. That's a whole bunch of slides that really take you through step by step that process that I laid out at the beginning of our webinar. Secondly, we've got a course that we deliver for Fabric, because Fabric is the news data platform for Microsoft. It's platform as a service, and Power BI and Fabric really work close together. They really are. The Microsoft have really got them kind of working close together. So if you're using Power BI, I kind of suspect that some of you might be using Fabric as well. So we've got a 3-day course which is based upon the DP700 qualification, which is again prepares you for that exam, but also really gives you a really good grounding in Fabric. And with the Power BI course is a really good combination to kind of get to grips with how to use this software and get the most out of it. As a company, I should also say, again, forgive me for doing the pitch here, but that's the payoff, isn't it, for coming on the webinar, that we also are experts in Azure, Databricks, Data Factory, Fabric, and Power BI as our kind of bread and butter. That's what we do all kind of most of the time. Please feel free to mail me at any time if you have any questions. So if you don't want to put a question into that Q&A there, then please do mail me. There's my email address. It's rutherfordb@ioanalytics. And if you want to get in touch, then you can mail me at that address, or you can just mail it to our inquiries as well.